In the frozen shadows of Pine Hollow, 7-year-old Elise clings to her French bulldog, Etoile, as a cruel guardian ties him to a lamppost in a raging blizzard, her only light in a world darkened by loss. With her mother fading in a hospital, bed and a sinister secret unraveling, a neighbor's watchful eye becomes her salvation. What begins as a desperate act of loyalty explodes into a gripping fight for truth, where a little girl's courage and a puppy's love defy the coldest of nights. Will they triumph over the wolves lurking in plain sight, or will the snow bury their hope forever? Welcome to Frenchie Tales, where the stubby tails and big hearts of French bulldogs weave heartwarming stories of love and resilience. If you want to watch more stories of dogs, like and subscribe Frenchie Tales. In the shadowed heart of Pine Hollow, where the wind carried secrets older than the pines themselves, winter descended like a thief in the night, stealing warmth and leaving only silence in its wake. The town lay nestled between frost-kissed hills, its narrow streets winding beneath a canopy of skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky as if pleading for spring. Snow didn't just fall here. It settled, heavy and unyielding, cloaking rooftops and lampposts in a shroud of white that muffled every sound. On this particular December evening, as the first stars pierced the darkening veil above, a small figure stood alone on the porch of a weathered yellow house, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Something was coming. A shift, a spark, a story, about to unfold, and the town, though it didn't know it yet, held its breath for what would emerge from the cold. Elise Moreau was 7 years old, a wisp of a girl with hazel eyes that shimmered like the last light on a frozen lake. Her short, wavy black hair peeked out from beneath the hood of her faded green coat, a hand-me-down from her mother that hung loose around her small frame. She clutched the edges of her sleeves, her fingers folding together, a nervous tic she'd carried since she was 4, when the world she knew had cracked open and spilled its warmth into the void. Her father, Julian Moreau, had been a soldier, a man of gentle strength whose laughter once filled their little home like sunlight through a window. He smelled of cedar and tobacco, and every night, without fail, he'd kneel by her bed to tell her tales of brave explorers and hidden stars. But 3 years ago, just days after her 4th birthday, he'd left for a war he never returned from. A knock on the door, a folded flag, and a silence that never lifted. Now, Elise stood on the porch, her boots scuffing the snow-dusted boards, staring out at the street where shadows stretched long and thin. The yellow house behind her creaked in the wind, its paint peeling like old skin, a testament to years of neglect and sorrow. Inside, her mother, Claire Moreau, lay fragile and fading, her soft brown hair splayed across a pillow in a hospital, bed miles away. Claire had been a seamstress, her nimble fingers stitching life into every seam, mittens for Elise, curtains for the windows, dreams into the quiet evenings they shared. But illness had crept in like a thief, stealing her strength, her voice, until one day she'd collapsed mid-stitch, leaving Elise in the care of Vincent Laroche, the man Claire had turned to in her desperation. Vincent was a shadow of a man, tall and lean, with eyes like chipped ice and a smile that never quite reached them. To the neighbors, he was a war buddy of Julian's, a dependable figure who shoveled the walk and tipped his hat at the grocer. He'd arrived in Pine Hollow 2 years ago after Claire's headaches began, offering help with a quiet charm that masked something darker. At first he'd been kind, fixing the leaky faucet, carrying groceries, calling Elise little one with a grin, but when Claire wasn't looking, his mask slipped. His words sharpened, his patience thinned, and his gaze turned cold, as if Elise were a burden he hadn't signed up for. She learned to tiptoe around him, to shrink into herself, her hands folding tighter when he muttered under his breath about useless kids or wasted time. The town of Pine Hollow moved slowly in winter, its people bundled in thick coats and scarves, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the snow. Chimneys puffed smoke into the grey sky, and the glow of Christmas lights flickered faintly behind frost-covered windows, a fragile attempt at cheer. But for Elise there was no warmth to cling to. Her father's absence was a hole she couldn't fill, and her mother's hospital bed was a distant ache she couldn't reach. Vincent's presence loomed like a storm cloud, unpredictable and heavy, and the yellow house felt less like a home and more like a cage. She spent her days outside when she could, under the cedar tree in the backyard where she and Julian used to sit, whispering to the wind as if he might hear her. That evening, as the snow deepened and the wind howled through the narrow alleys, Elise lingered on the porch, her small figure silhouetted against the dim light spilling from the kitchen window. She didn't know why she stayed out there, shivering, in her thin coat, but something kept her rooted. A feeling, faint but insistent, like a thread pulling at her heart. The street was empty, the town hushed, but in the distance a shadow moved through the snow, growing closer with each step. It carried something, a crate, small and wooden, with faint wisps of steam rising from its edges. Elise's breath caught, her hazel eyes widening. Whoever it was, whatever it held, it was coming for her, and in that moment, beneath the weight of winter and loss, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. The wind bit harder as the figure drew closer, a dark shape against the swirling snow, boots crunching through the icy crust that coated Pine Hollow's streets. Elise Moreau stood frozen on the porch, her small hands gripping the railing, her hazel eyes locked on the stranger. The yellow house groaned behind her, its windows rattling as if impatient for what was to come. The air smelled of frost and pine, sharp and clean, and the faint glow of the street lamp cast jagged shadows across the snow. She didn't know who this was, but something in the way they moved, steady, deliberate, despite a slight limp, felt familiar, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. In their arms, they carried a wooden crate, small and rough-hewn with tiny holes punched into its sides, and a thin wisp of warmth curling upward into the cold. The figure stopped at the base of the porch steps, snow clinging to the hem of a worn, brown leather jacket. It was Mateo Durand, a man Elise barely remembered from a blurry day 3 years ago, her father's funeral. He was wiry, in his late 30s, with a short beard flecked with grey and warm brown eyes that carried a weight she couldn't name. His left leg dragged slightly, a remnant of shrapnel from a war he rarely spoke of, and his breath puffed out in clouds as he looked up at her. "Elise," he said, his voice low and rough but kind, "I've been looking for you." He set the crate down gently, as if it held something precious, and knelt to her height, the snow soaking into his knees. "Your papa made me promise something a long time ago. Took me a while to keep it, but I'm here now." Elise's heart thudded in her chest, her fingers unfolding from their nervous knot. She didn't speak. She rarely did these days, but her eyes asked the question her voice couldn't. Mateo smiled faintly, a tired curve of his lips, and lifted the lid of the crate. Inside, nestled in a nest of soft fleece and curled around a warm pack, was a French bulldog puppy. It was tiny, no bigger than a loaf of bread, its coat a glossy black, with a white patch splashed across its chest like a spilled star. Its big, round eyes blinked up at her, sleepy and curious, and its wrinkled face tilted as it let out a soft, snuffling yawn. Its little tail wagged once, then twice, a hesitant flicker of trust. For the first time in months, Elise felt her breath catch. Not from fear, but from something softer, something alive. She knelt beside the crate, her green coat brushing the snow, and reached out with trembling hands. The puppy leaned into her touch, its warmth seeping through her cold fingers, and she whispered, "Étoile." The name came unbidden, a gift, from the stories her father used to tell about stars that guided lost travelers home. She looked up at Mateo, her voice barely audible over the wind. "For me?" He nodded, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "Julian said if anything happened to him, I was to find you the brightest little soul I could. Said you'd need someone to wait for you no matter what." Inside the yellow house, the kitchen light flickered as Vincent Laroche paced, his boots thumping against the worn linoleum. Claire had been gone for weeks now, her hospital bed a distant anchor pulling at his patience. He'd agreed to watch Elise out of obligation, not affection, and the house felt smaller with every passing day. He glanced out the window, his jaw tightening as he saw Mateo and the crate, but he didn't move, not yet. Elise didn't notice him watching. She was too lost in Étoile, lifting the puppy gently from the crate and cradling him against her chest. His snorts and wiggles drew a small, rare smile from her, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Matteo stood, brushing snow from his jacket. "He's yours now, Elise. Your papa wanted you to have something to hold on to." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be around if you need me. Not far, just over on Elm Street." He tipped his head and turned back into the storm, leaving her alone with Étoile. She carried him to the cedar tree in the backyard, its branches sagging under the weight of snow. It was their tree, hers and Julian's, where they'd once hung paper stars made from old letters, each one a promise he'd whispered, "If I'm ever lost, follow the stars, and I'll find you." She hadn't added a new one since he left, but now, with Étoile snuffling in her arms, she felt the stir of something new. The night deepened and the cold pressed in, but Elise didn't care. She sat beneath the tree, Étoile curled against her, his warmth a tiny flame against the winter's chill. She traced the white patch on his chest with her finger, imagining it was a star fallen from the sky just for her. Inside, Vincent's shadow moved across the window, his muttered curses barely audible through the glass. But out here, under the cedar's watchful branches, Elise felt safe for the first time in years. Étoile's big eyes met hers, steady and trusting, and she whispered, "You're my star now." The wind sighed through the tree, carrying her words upward, and somewhere in the vast snowy silence, a father's promise began to take root. The snow fell heavier in Pine Hollow that night, blanketing the town in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. The yellow house stood hunched against the storm, its windows glowing faintly like tired eyes peering into the dark. Elise Moreau sat cross-legged beneath the cedar tree, her green coat dusted with white. Étoile nestled in her lap. The French bulldog's warmth seeped through her thin mittens, his soft snorts a quiet rhythm against the wind's low howl. She didn't want to go inside, not yet. Out here, with the snow piling around her and the tree's branches swaying above, she could pretend the world was still hers, still kind. But the back door creaked open, and Vincent Laroche's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Get in here, kid. You'll freeze, and I'm not dragging you to the hospital too." Elise flinched, her hands folding tight around Étoile. She rose slowly, the puppy's big eyes blinking up at her as she carried him toward the house. Vincent stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his ice-blue eyes narrowing as they flicked from her to the dog. "What's that thing doing in here?" he snapped, his tone sharp enough to make her step back. "It's from Papa's friend," she whispered, clutching Étoile closer. "His name's Étoile." Vincent's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his stubbled cheek. "No dogs in the house," he said flatly, turning away as if the matter were settled. But Elise didn't move. She stood there, small and defiant, until he glanced back, his gaze hardening. "You hear me? Outside with it." Claire Moreau's absence had changed everything. She'd been taken to St. Martin's Hospital 3 weeks ago, after collapsing in the kitchen, her needle still threaded with blue yarn. The doctors called it a neurological event, their words heavy with uncertainty, and she hadn't woken since. Elise had kissed her goodbye that morning, her mother's frail hand cool against her cheek, and now the house felt hollow without her. Vincent had stayed, claiming duty to Claire, but his patience wore thinner each day. He'd stopped pretending, to care when the neighbors weren't watching. His smiles faded, his words grew curt, and the air around him crackled with something Elise couldn't name but felt in her bones. For a few days, she kept Étoile hidden, sneaking him scraps of bread and letting him sleep in a cardboard box by the laundry vent. His snuffling breaths and wagging tail were a secret light in the dark, a piece of her father she could hold on to. But Vincent noticed. He always noticed. One evening, as the snow piled high outside and the wind rattled the shutters, he found muddy paw prints on the kitchen floor. "I told you," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "No dogs inside." Elise shrank back, Étoile trembling in her arms. "He's cold," she said, barely audible. Vincent's hand twitched, then he pointed to the back door. "Out. Now, or I'll do it myself." She obeyed, wrapping Étoile in an old scarf and setting him in the shed behind the house, its walls thin and splintered. She whispered apologies through the crack in the door, her breath fogging in the icy air, promising to bring him inside when Vincent slept. But the nights grew harsher, the cold meaner, and Vincent's temper flared like a storm waiting to break. It happened on a Tuesday, when the sky was a bruised grey and the snow fell in stinging sheets. Elise had snuck Etoile inside to warm his shivering body by the fireplace, his black coat slick with frost. Vincent came home early, boots thudding against the floor, and stopped dead when he saw the puppy. His face twisted, a shadow passing. Over it, and before Elise could speak, he grabbed Etoile by the scruff. "No!" Elise cried, lunging forward, but Vincent shoved her back with one hand, her small body stumbling against the wall. He stormed outside, Etoile whimpering in his grip, and marched across the street to the park. The swings hung frozen. The lamppost stood stark against the snow, and Vincent pulled a rope from his coat pocket. Worn, frayed, like he'd planned this. He tied Etoile to the post, the puppy's paws sinking into the drifts, his big eyes wide with confusion. "Let him freeze," Vincent muttered, his breath a harsh cloud. "Maybe you'll learn to listen." He turned to Elise, who'd followed barefoot into the snow, her coat flapping open. "You say a word and he's gone for good. Pound won't take a mutt like that in this weather." Then he walked away, disappearing into the storm. Elise ran. To Etoile, her socks soaking through, her hands shaking as she tugged at the knot. It wouldn't budge. The rope was too tight, her fingers too cold. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't sob. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his trembling body, her thin frame a shield against the wind. "I won't leave." "You," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chill sinking into her bones. The snow stung her face, the night closed in, and Etoile's whimpers grew faint. She didn't know how long she stayed there, her head drooping against his fur, her breath slowing as the cold tightened its grip. But in that moment, beneath the lampost's weak light, a 7-year-old girl made a choice, not to break but to fight for the one thing she still had. The snow swirled mercilessly around the lamppost in Pine Hollow's park, a relentless dance, of white that blurred the edges of the world. Elise Moreau knelt in the drifts, her small body curled around Etoile, the French bulldog's black fur barely visible against the storm. Her green coat was plastered with ice, her socks sodden and useless, but she didn't move. The puppy's whimpers had faded to soft shivers, his big eyes half closed as he pressed against her, seeking warmth she could barely give. The lampost's dim glow flickered above them, casting a frail halo over the scene. A girl and her dog, alone in a night that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. Across the street, in a small house with ivy-clad shutters, a pair of sharp blue eyes watched from behind a steamed-up window, and a heart that had known too much loss began to beat. Faster. Sophie Leclerc was 32, a librarian with a quiet grace and a habit of knitting scarves she rarely wore. Her home smelled of old books and chamomile tea, its walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of stories she'd collected over years. She'd moved to Pine Hollow 5 years ago, after her younger brother died in a climbing accident, seeking a place where the world moved slower, and the pain might dull. She'd seen Elise before, the shy girl in the green coat, always alone, her hands folded like a prayer. Sophie had waved once or twice, offered a smile, but the child's eyes had darted away, shadowed by something heavy. Lately, she'd noticed, Vincent too, his clipped words, his too tight grip on Elise's arm at the market, the way the yellow house grew quieter with each passing day. Now, as she stood at her kitchen sink rinsing a mug, Sophie's gaze caught on the shape by the lamppost. She squinted through the storm, her breath fogging the glass, and her stomach dropped. It was Elise, unmistakable even in the chaos of snow, and something small huddled beside her. "Oh no," she whispered, the mug slipping from her hands, into the sink with a dull clink. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing her long grey coat, still unbuttoned, and a pair of boots, she rushed out the door, the cold biting her cheeks as she crossed the street. Her boots sank into the drifts, the wind tugging at her dark curls, but she didn't slow until she reached them. "Elise!" Sophie's voice cracked as she dropped to her knees, snow soaking through her jeans. The girl didn't respond. Her head rested on Etoile's back, her lips pale, her breath shallow. The puppy lifted his head weakly, his white patch stark against his dark coat, and let out a faint bark. Sophie's hands moved fast, brushing snow from Elise's face, feeling the icy chill of her skin. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" No answer, just the wind's cruel howl. She scooped Elise into her arms, shockingly light like a bird, and tucked Etoile inside her coat, his small body trembling against her chest. "Hold on," she murmured to both of them, and stumbled back toward her house, slipping once on the ice but catching herself against a tree. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave, the fireplace crackling softly in the corner. Sophie laid Elise on the couch, piling blankets over her small frame, then set Etoile on a towel by the hearth, rubbing his fur to coax life back into him. His big eyes followed her, trusting despite the cold that had nearly claimed him. She grabbed her phone and dialed Madame Hélène, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses down. A stout woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and hands steady enough to mend anything broken. "Hélène, it's Sophie. I need you now. It's the Moreau girl. She's half frozen and there's a puppy. Please hurry." Hélène didn't ask questions. She was there in minutes, her wool coat dusted with snow, a first aid kit under her arm. "She's hypothermic," Hélène said, pressing a hand to Elise's forehead, then checking her pulse with practiced calm. "But she's strong, she'll pull through. The dog too, you got them just in time." Sophie nodded, her throat tight, watching as Hélène tucked a hot water bottle under the blankets and coaxed Etoile closer to the fire. The puppy's tail gave a weak wag, his snorts returning as warmth seeped back into him. Sophie knelt beside, Elise brushing damp hair from her face. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, though she already suspected the answer. The girl stirred, her hazel eyes fluttering open, and in a voice barely above a breath, she said, "Vincent." "He tied him up. I couldn't leave him." Sophie's chest tightened, a mix of fury and sorrow flooding her. She thought of her brother, his bright laugh, his reckless spirit, and how she'd failed to save him. She wouldn't fail Elise. "You're safe now," she said, her voice firm despite the tears pricking her eyes. "Both of you." She looked at Etoile, his wrinkled face peering up at her, and then at Elise, whose hand reached weakly for the puppy. Sophie guided it to his fur, and a ghost of a smile touched the girl's lips. Outside the storm raged on, but in that small house a bond was forming, a promise born of snow and fire, sealed by a woman who decided to listen when no one else would. The storm battered Pine Hollow through the night, a relentless siege of snow and wind that rattled Sophie Leclerc's small house. Inside, the fire cast a warm glow across the room, shadows dancing over the bookshelves and the quilt-draped couch where Elise Moreau slept. Etoile, the little French bulldog, lay curled beside her, his black coat rising and falling with steady breaths, the white patch on his chest a faint star in the dim light. His snorts had returned, soft and rhythmic, a quiet reassurance that life still flickered in his small body. Sophie sat in an armchair nearby, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the girl and her dog. The clock ticked past midnight, but sleep eluded her. Vincent's name echoed in her mind, a dark thread she couldn't untangle, and Elise's whispered confession burned like a coal in her chest. Madame Hélène had left an hour ago. Her stern face softened with concern as she'd pressed a thermos of soup into Sophie's hands. "Keep her warm," she'd said, her voice gruff but kind, "and call me if she worsens. That man, Vincent, he's trouble. Always has been." Sophie had nodded, her thoughts already racing. She'd seen the signs, Vincent's curt nods, the way Elise flinched when he was near, the yellow house growing colder even before Claire's collapse. Now, with Elise's words and Etoile's trembling form as proof, suspicion hardened into resolve. She wouldn't let this go. She couldn't. Not when a 7-year-old had nearly frozen to save a puppy Vincent had left to die. Morning crept in, grey and sluggish, the storm easing into a soft drizzle that melted the snow's edges. Elise stirred, her hazel eyes blinking, open, and Sophie moved to her side with a mug of warm milk. "Hey, brave one," she said gently, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. "How do you feel?" Elise's lips parted, then closed, her hands folding briefly before reaching for Etoile. Better, she murmured, her fingers sinking into his fur. Is he okay? Sophie smiled, nodding toward the puppy, who wagged his stubby tail. He's a fighter like you. Elise's gaze lingered on Etoile, then lifted to Sophie, hesitant but searching. Vincent. He'll come back for me, won't he? The question hung heavy, and Sophie's heart clenched. Not if I can help it, she said, her voice steady. But I need to know more, Elise. Can you tell me what happened? The girl nodded, her small voice weaving a tale of Vincent's growing anger, his muttered threats, his banishment of Etoile to the shed, the night he'd tied the puppy to the lamppost. He said I'd lose him if I told, she finished, her eyes glistening. Sophie took her hand, squeezing gently. You're not losing him, or me. We'll figure this out together. Elise's lips trembled, but she nodded, a spark of trust igniting in her gaze. Later, while Elise napped with Etoile snuggled against her, Sophie slipped upstairs to the attic, a cramped space filled with boxes and the scent of dust. She'd moved Julian Moreau's things there years ago, after Claire had asked her to store them during a spring cleaning. Now she pulled a wooden box from beneath a stack of old novels, its lid etched with a faint JM. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded red ribbon, Julian's words to Claire from his deployments. But at the bottom, one envelope stood out, unsealed, marked in his steady hand. For Elise when she's ready. Sophie's breath caught. She carried it downstairs, setting it beside Elise's blanket, waiting for the right moment. When Elise woke, Sophie handed her the letter. It's from your papa, she said softly. I think he'd want you to read it now. Elise's fingers trembled as she unfolded the page, the paper creased and faintly yellowed. Julian's handwriting spilled across it, warm and urgent. My little light, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. I'm sorry I couldn't stay, but I need you to know you're my star, bright and strong. If I'm not there to keep you safe, find someone who will. Someone kind, not controlling. Trust your heart, Elise. It's wiser than you think. Some wolves hide in sheep's clothing, but you'll see through them. I love you forever, Papa. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket, her small altogether, her small shoulders squaring as if the words had stitched something solid into her soul. That afternoon, Sophie called Matteo Durand, the man who'd brought Etoile. He arrived, his limp more pronounced in the damp cold, and listened as she recounted the night at the lamppost and Vincent's military past, a mission gone wrong, Julien's death, a reprimand buried in records, Matteo confirmed. He blamed himself, Matteo said, his voice low, but he blamed Julian more, took it out on you, I reckon. Sophie's jaw tightened. She showed him photos she'd snapped of Etoile tied up, Elise's frostbitten hands, and a recording of Vincent's threat she'd caught on her phone when he'd banged on her door that morning, demanding Elise back. Matteo's eyes darkened. I'll testify, for Julian, for her. By evening, word spread through Pine Hollow, quiet whispers in the bakery, glances at the grocer. Madame Hélène rallied neighbors, bringing soup and blankets, and a social worker was due the next day. Sophie watched Elise draw a star on a scrap of paper, Etoile's head resting on her knee, and saw strength blooming in the girl's quiet resolve. Outside, the drizzle turned to mist, and the lamppost stood silent, a witness to a truth finally breaking free. The mist hung low over Pine Hollow, softening the town's sharp edges as if the world itself were exhaling a long-held breath. The snow had begun to thaw, dripping from rooftops and pooling in the hollows of the streets, revealing patches of earth that whispered of spring. Inside Sophie Leclerc's small house, the air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, the fireplace casting a golden glow over the room where Elise Moreau sat at the kitchen table. Etoile, her French bulldog, sprawled at her feet, his black coat gleaming, the white patch on his chest rising with each contented snort. The past week had unraveled like a thread pulled from a worn sweater, Vincent's lies exposed, his threats silenced. But today something stronger was weaving itself into place, a quiet, unbreakable hope. Elise's hazel eyes followed Sophie. As she moved through the kitchen, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. The letter from Julian rested on the table, its edges worn from her careful fingers, a tether to a father who'd never truly left. She'd read it again that morning, tracing his words. Find someone kind, not controlling. And felt them, settled deep, a compass for the path ahead. The social worker, Madame Dupont, had come the day before, her silver hair glinting in the sunlight as she'd listened to Elise's story, her voice steady as she detailed Vincent's cruelty. With Matteo's testimony, Sophie's evidence, and the town's growing murmur, Vincent had been escorted out of Pine Hollow that night, charges pending, his shadow lifted like a storm passing over the hills. But the true miracle arrived that afternoon when Sophie's phone rang with news from St. Martin's Hospital. Claire Moreau had woken from her coma, her soft brown eyes blinking open to a world she'd nearly lost. The doctors called it a recovery against odds. Her illness, a rare brain condition, had stabilized, and though her steps were slow, her spirit was stirring. Sophie bundled Elise and Etoile into her car, the puppy's tail wagging as they drove through the melting snow to the hospital. When they entered Claire's room, the air caught in Elise's throat. Her mother sat propped against pillows, thinner than before. Her hair cropped short, but her smile, fragile yet radiant, lit the sterile space like dawn breaking through fog. "Elise," Claire whispered, her voice a thread of sound, and the girl ran to her, burying her face in her mother's arms. Etoile waddled behind, snuffling at Claire's hand until she laughed, a weak, beautiful sound, and scratched his wrinkled head. Sophie stood back, tears pricking her eyes as Claire read Julian's letter, her fingers trembling over his words. "He knew," she murmured, looking at Elise. "He always knew you'd be strong." She turned to Sophie, gratitude shining through her exhaustion. "Thank you for keeping her safe." Sophie shook her head, her voice thick. "She kept me going too." Days later, Claire returned to the yellow house, its porch swing repainted white by neighbors who'd rallied in quiet solidarity. The flower beds bloomed with early crocuses, planted by Elise's small hands, and laughter, soft, tentative, began to echo within its walls again. Claire taught art online now, her gentle voice guiding children through sketches of stars and trees, her strength growing with each lesson. Elise went back to school part-time, her round glasses perched on her nose, a pencil always tucked behind her ear. She walked Etoile every morning, his stout legs trotting past the lamppost, now marked with a wooden sign reading "For the Brave Ones," and waved to the mailman, her quiet confidence a light that drew smiles. Sophie became a fixture in their lives, her librarian's calm, a steady anchor. She taught Elise to knit stars from wool, and together they hung them on the cedar tree, a constellation of memories and promises kept. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Claire, Elise, and Sophie stood beneath that tree, Etoile snuffling at their feet. Elise held a paper lantern, crafted from rice paper and string, its belly glowing with a tiny flame. Inside, she'd tucked a star she'd drawn, a bold silver one, and a note that read, "Thank you, Papa." They lit it together, watching as it rose, a soft beacon against the twilight, drifting higher until it joined the stars above. "He'd be so proud," Claire said, her hand resting on Elise's shoulder. The girl nodded, her hazel eyes bright, and whispered, "I found the good ones, Papa." Etoile barked a joyful snort and chased his tail in the grass, his warmth a constant beside her. Sophie smiled, her heart full, knowing she'd found her own redemption in this small, fierce family. In Pine Hollow, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and forgiveness, and the yellow house stood as a testament to love reclaimed, not loud, not perfect, but real. Beneath the cedar, a final star swayed, catching the last light, and in that quiet moment, a father's promise shone brighter than ever, a miracle stitched into the lives of a girl, her dog, and the people who chose to believe in them.